Hello and welcome. In this video, I would like to take a look at the recent FAQ changes released on November 11th, as they do provide significant changes in terms of how the Adeptus Mechanicus forces will play out in the future. So with that being said, let's take a look at these rule changes that just came out, and conveniently so for a video I released and a couple of videos that I've already recorded this week that now have to be modified, though that tends to be my luck with timing. So let's see what these rules look like. The first change in this rules update is a change to the universal rules in terms of how aircraft function within the game. This rule change being that you're now limited in terms of how many aircraft models you can take within an army, being that you're only allowed 1 aircraft in a combat patrol game, 2 aircraft in games that are up to 2,000 points, and 3 aircrafts in games above 2,000 points. This is actually a rather major change for the AdMech, as a lot of lists played quite a few different Archaeopters, and if you look at the 2,000 point list video that I made for the AdMech, you'll notice that the very first list includes up to 6 aircraft, which was something that wasn't super common, but something that did occur within AdMech lists, and many lists did make use of 3 or more, but many lists also used very few of them, which was a benefit to those lists as well. With that being said, I'm not the biggest fan of this specific change in rules because a lot of people did own a lot of aircraft models, and in some cases, some armies might have units of aircraft, which are now significantly hindered by the limitations of only 2 aircraft models as opposed to units. More so, I can definitely see the fantasy of having a lot of flyers, and I would have rather they change this rule in such a way that allowed you to bring more aircraft if you so desired, but maybe penalize you in some other way, maybe making aircraft cost command points to bring after the first aircraft, or something of that nature where you're still limited, but you can still utilize those different aircraft models that you purchased within the past. Especially if you went out and bought some Archaeopters, you're now kind of stuck with them, which is a little bit unfortunate. Anyway, with that being covered, that is pretty much the only rule that has changed in terms of rules directly, but there have been some changes to the points values of different AdMech units, so let's take a look at how those points changed and how they might affect how the AdMech army plays. The first thing we should look at is the HQ choices. There have been 2 total changes for different HQ choices, with the first one being a 10-point increase on the Skitarii Marshal. This is a pretty reasonable increase, as that points increase brings him up to 55 points, the same points value as an Engine Seer or a Techno-Archaeologist, making them more comparable in terms of points and power level. If anything, the Skitarii Marshal is still a very powerful model and still has a lot more utility than either the Engine Seer or the Techno-Archaeologist, especially when equipped with something like the relic known as Exemplar's Eternity, making him almost as good, if not better, than the Tech Priest Dominus, who is actually 75 points in his own right. This is kind of an interesting change, but I don't think this change is really going to hurt his playability, as he's still going to be one of the better HQ choices that you have access to and one that you can field very easily. The other change that was made to the HQ choices is the Tech Priest Manipulus has gone up by 10 points as well, making him cost 80 points baseline. Once again, not an insignificant change, but not one that would make me not play a Manipulus within an army that really benefited from the Manipulus's buff. Though with that being said, do keep in mind that it's usually not the change of any one model, but rather the points change across a collection of different models that eventually add up to make it much harder to include everything within one list. So even though the points change to the Manipulus and the Marshal doesn't seem like much, you do have to keep it in the context that between these 2 models, you've just lost 20 points in your list, and you've probably lost another 20 to 100 points across different units that you would normally include alongside these 2 HQ choices. And before we leave our HQ choices, there is one more thing we have to cover, which is the Holy Order choices, as the Holy Orders saw some point changes as well. The first change is a 5-point increase to the Holy Order of the Logi. This brings up the Holy Order to 40 points total, making it another minor increase, but once again, you have to keep it in context that usually you're putting this Holy Order on a Manipulus, meaning that combination is 15 points higher and not just at 10 points or 5 points individually. Additionally, they did make one other change that I found a little bit strange, which is an increase to the Holy Order of the Artisans, which didn't see much play, but has seen an increase of 10 points, bringing it up to 35 points. I do have to wonder why this was the case, considering that was usually Logi and Magi that saw the most play, and Artisans and Genitors didn't see all that much play, making me wonder if this is a typo or an intentional increase. Does anyone know a situation in which Artisans needed a point increase, or are you like me and think this is probably some kind of error that was supposed to increase the points value of a different Holy Order, or just simply a typo in terms of the first number, which was supposed to be 25 and accidentally was typed in as 35. In either case, I do hope Games Workshop clarifies this one, as the Artisans didn't really need to be changed, even though the Logi probably did. Now, in terms of troops, the only change that occurred was that the Skitarii Rangers and the Skitarii Vanguard went up by 1 point per model, and out of all of the different changes, I don't think this is the biggest change, as this kind of reverts them to the point where they were before the new edition released, and they were still fine even before the changes, as both the Vanguard and Rangers are very powerful units that have only seen power increases going into 9th edition, and with the addition of the veteran cohort, they are incredibly powerful. So even though this points increase will cause some strains on your army list, considering once again you're taking those Skitarii alongside something like a Manipulus, you're still doing perfectly fine, as we've seen a lot of lists that utilize smaller units of Skitarii as well as lists that utilize bigger units, and the lists that were utilizing the bigger units are going to be the ones that are hurt the most. However, the lists that were already including smaller units of Skitarii are probably going to be much better off than the lists that were including larger units, especially considering that a lot of the lists that were including large units of Skitarii were also making heavy utilization of something like the Flyers, which in a lot of cases aren't even legal lists anymore. So that is a little bit of a bummer to the players who did like the army in that type of style, but if you're really dedicated to those large blocks of Skitarii, you can still probably find a way of including them despite the points change. Elites is another unit type that saw a rather minor increase, an increase of 2 points per model within the Sicarian Infiltrators and Ruststalkers. This is once again just another one of those taxation changes, and I think the Ruststalkers are definitely hit a lot harder by this than the Infiltrators are, considering they're more of a niche unit, while the Infiltrators are much more of a generalist unit that's still perfectly reasonable at 19 points per model. This is one of those situations where I wish they increased the points of the Infiltrators, but maybe did a slightly lesser increase on the Ruststalkers by maybe 1 point instead of 2 points, bringing them up to 18 as opposed to 19. However, once again, considering units of the Sicarians are between 5 and 10 models, you're only looking at an increase of 10 to 20 points per unit, but once again, it's a cumulative change, especially when you consider that AdMech lists ran 3 to 6 units of different Sicarians within their army list. Especially when you consider those larger units, you're looking at a points increase of almost 100 points just in Sicarians alone, which is about 5% of your army as a whole, and that can be rather rough, especially when coupled with that points increase in the troop choice as well as the HQ choice. As such, I think if you're going heavy Sicarians now, you're probably going to be taking a Vanguard detachment more likely than you are taking a battalion, as that cumulative points increase becomes a little burdensome if you're taking something like a brigade or a battalion like you did before. The points increases continue on our fast attack choice, with the Iron Strider seeing a points increase of 10 points baseline, bringing him up to a total of 85 points for an Iron Strider equipped with las cannons. I think this is a change most of us saw coming, and a lot of us agreed that 85 to 90 points was probably where the Iron Striders with las cannons should have been, considering how powerful they are, though in the context of all the other points changes, it's definitely a little bit rough, but I do think they're still going to be seeing play, and I still think they're perfectly fine at 85 points, considering how much mobility, firepower, and durability they bring to the table, even in smaller units of maybe 2 to 3 Iron Striders, as opposed to multiple units of 3 or 4 Iron Striders like we're still seeing even to this day. Then after the Iron Striders, we do see a rather heavy point increase in the Cerberus Raiders. Each Cerberus Raider has gone up by 4 points per Cerberus Raider, and saw a 5-point increase on their enhanced data tether. This brings them up to pretty much the same points cost as a unit of Sulphur Hounds. However, do remember the Sulphur Hound Alpha does cost more points, meaning that the Sulphur Hounds are still a little bit more expensive than the Raiders if taken without any upgrades. This does seem like a really heavy-handed increase on the Raiders, who had already seen a lot of changes going into 9th edition, and were generally already seeing a little less play in 9th edition in favor of things like the Sicarians and the Taraxi, so I'm not the biggest fan of this change, and while the Cerberus Raiders were a little bit undercosted before, I don't think this was really necessary, especially not in the context of the other points changes, and what I think is going to happen is we're probably going to see an increased use of those Taraxi sterilizers that we've already been seeing come to prominence, and we're probably going to continue seeing heavy use of the Infiltrators and maybe even Ruststalkers with a decrease in use of Cerberus Raiders. I don't think it's going to particularly impact the other fast attack choices, but I do think we're just going to probably see Cerberus Raiders getting cut from army lists, while we see other fast attack choices kind of taking their place. Though at the same time, I don't want to say that we're not going to see Cerberus Raiders at all. We're probably still going to see them show up from time to time, though I think we're going to be seeing way less of them going into the future, simply because they're already seeing less and less play in favor of some of those other units. And there's one other set of points changes within the AdMech forces, being a change to the Flyers, where both the Archaeopter Fusilier and Stratoraptor went up by 20 points, which is actually a rather significant point increase, and coupled with the restriction of Flyer units, it definitely hurts a lot of list building space in terms of how you utilize Flyers, and I really wish they took a little bit of a different approach, probably by increasing the points cost of the Fusilier as they did, because the Fusilier was heavily undercosted, while the Stratoraptor could have probably stayed the same points cost as it did before, considering now you were limited to 2 Flyers within an army, though I can see the justification for increasing the points on the Stratoraptor as well. However, I do think this is one of those changes where they probably pushed a little bit too far in the overcorrection position. With all those changes being noted, there was one other change to the points cost of the AdMech forces. This points change was actually a decrease in points, and the only decrease in points that I saw within the update. This points decrease was actually a substantial 10-point cut on each castle and robot, bringing them down to a base cost of 90 points per model. I think this is actually a rather good change overall, and I wish they would have done more things like that, maybe decreasing the points of the Sidonian Dragoons as well. However, I'm happy that they at least gave us something as opposed to simply increasing points across the board and not really changing anything in our favor. I will also add that the biggest issue with the Castellan robots wasn't necessarily their mobility or survivability or even their damage output, but rather their points cost, considering they were probably a little too expensive for what they brought to the table before, especially after their protocol nerf going into 9th edition. Now that they're 90 points baseline, they definitely become a little more interesting, though I do think what they need to do is reduce the points a tiny bit more, and they'll probably see a lot more play, though on the other hand, they did see minimal play before this in tournaments using the 9th edition AdMech rules, so maybe there's some more room for them now, and we might see some more of them on the battlefield, considering that's a pretty nice buff to those Castellan robots. With all these changes in mind, I will say these changes are probably going to hurt a lot of existing lists a lot more than people are first assuming, considering that even though all these points changes aren't that big in themselves, they will add up pretty quickly, and you're probably going to be losing about 100 to 200 points of different models that you could bring to the table, which can amount to quite a lot in some cases, as that's essentially 5 to 10% of your army, and that roughly translates to a unit of Sicarians or a unit of Iron Striders that you can no longer bring to the table simply because of all the points increases across different models. And if you're already utilizing heavy usage of troops and flyers and the Sicarians, you might be seeing as much as a 300 point swing in terms of what you're building within your army, and that's actually a rather massive change, though I do think you could still build a pretty good army that can still be very competitive within the AdMech, even though all these changes did hurt how much you can bring to the table, and considering AdMech had already lost their dominance within the top 4 environment of tournaments, it does seem like a little bit of an overcorrection. However, many of the other top armies are seeing a decrease in their power level as well, so it'll probably balance out in the grand scheme of things, considering the Drukhari got hit as well, and the Orcs saw a minor decrease as well, so it's not the end of the world, and I think AdMech will be fine in the long run, though there might be a little bit of pain as they transition from their old style of play to this new style of play, considering the new points increases. And one last thing, keep an eye out on those Corpus Cari Electro Priests, because I do think them being 15 points is going to make them a lot more viable, especially considering the points increase to the Sicarians, and the ability of that Warlord trait that allows you to deep strike a single unit of Electro Priests. And it's not only the change to the Sicarians, it's also the fact that they put out quite a lot of shots, and the increase in points of the Skitarii as well as the Manipulus does discourage you from utilizing larger blocks of Skitarii. However, I don't think large Skitarii blocks are going away anytime soon, though I do think we're going to see a minor reduction in terms of how often we see them within tournament lists, though I do think there's still potential for them to be very good. And like I said, I don't think they're going to change that much outside of the lists that are now illegal, such as my first list within the 2000 AdMech Army list video, which included 6 different flyers and can no longer do that simply because of rules changes, but anything that's just a pure points change, I think you're going to see a lot of the same, just with maybe one less unit of Sicarians or something like the Cerberus Raiders, though AdMech do tend to have a lot of variety, so you'll also probably see a lot of development in maybe alternative builds. However, I think the builds that already exist are still going to be playable if someone wants to play them, which shows that AdMech is a pretty great army overall, as things don't really become unplayable as much as they just become a little more fringe, or simply get sat on the sideline for a short amount of time before returning back into the meta after some kind of rules change such as this. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day.